Grace and peace to you in the name of God the Creator, Christ the Redeemer, and the Spirit who sustains us. Amen. I just finished listening to the novel Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. It takes place in the mid-12th century in England, and the plot centers around building a cathedral at a monastery. There are religious and lay people in the book who support the building of the cathedral, and religious and lay people who oppose the building of the cathedral. Many of the main characters in the book are powerful people. Some of them rise to powerful positions as a result of their hard work and dedication to God and to doing the right thing, while others manipulate and scheme their way to power. That's not surprising. Successful fiction reflects back to us the patterns of human nature, good and bad, on an exaggerated scale. What was surprising to me, though, is that some of the monks and bishops in the book were more concerned with accumulating power and wealth than they were with being faithful, even to the point of using the promise of absolution from sin to condone murder. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that there aren't people of faith today who act in the same way. I know there are. But it always strikes me as being contradictory to the gospel. It boggles my mind that people would deliberately make choices like these in their lives. But then I remember that to a certain extent, that's human nature. As a species, we always have been and always will be concerned about power. We think about who holds power and who is seeking power, and whether the person in power supports the same things that are important to us, or whether their values in some way contradict our own and therefore pose some sort of a threat to us. This is true on all sorts of levels. It's true in families, where parents have the power to enforce the rules and revoke privileges when necessary. It's true in the workplace, where the sort of boss you have is a powerful influence on employee satisfaction and performance. It's true societally. Our responsibility to vote thoughtfully is one of the most important responsibilities we have as Americans. It's true even at church, where the pastor and the church council are people of authority and influence. The disciples' focus on power and greatness in tonight's gospel is therefore not really that surprising to us. After all, they are just as human as we are. But it is another example of the lack of understanding they have over who Jesus really is and what it means to be Messiah. And that's not surprising. They've been through a dizzying series of events, including Jesus telling them for the first time that he will be killed and raised again, and then a mountaintop experience where Peter, James, and John see Jesus in all his divine glory, accompanied by Elijah and Moses. How do you adjust your worldview to incorporate an event like that? And so when they return back home to Capernaum, Jesus takes care to be a little stealthy as they're going through Galilee. Jesus is well known there, and he must know that the disciples have had about all they can handle. They need rest and solitude and a chance to process all of this new information. But as they're traveling, Jesus tells them again that he will suffer and die at the hands of his enemies. I think he knows that they didn't really get it the first time. So he's trying again to get them to understand that he is not the kind of Messiah they think he is. He is not a military leader come to set the world to rights. God's reign is not to be imposed by force. They still don't understand, but this time nobody responds to him at all, perhaps because he took Peter to task for the way he responded the last time Jesus told them this. Now, we don't know what the disciples are thinking. Do they still think Jesus is wrong about what it means to be the Messiah? Do they think he's exaggerating, or maybe the stress of their ministry and travel is getting to him? Or is what Jesus is saying so far outside their experience of the world that they just can't process it? And so they revert to doing what human beings do when they're not quite sure of the power dynamics at work. They talk about who's most likely to get a promotion. The desire for power, for greatness, is certainly in the mix here. After all, everyone anticipated the Messiah to be a powerful figure, and the closer you are to someone with power, the more power you have. But I think the other thing they're hoping for is recognition. We like to be honored and respected for the things we do well. It validates for us that we are doing the right things and doing them well. But Jesus is not interested in offering promotions. He's still trying to make the disciples understand that they are coming at this from the wrong perspective. In order to understand what Jesus is trying to tell us, we have to get out of the way of our very human desire to be recognized and granted authority. In God's reign, things work differently. And so Jesus says to them, if you want to be great, you have to put yourself last. You have to serve others. You have to become vulnerable. And then he uses a child as an object lesson. If you welcome a child, you welcome Jesus. And if you welcome Jesus, you welcome the one who sent Jesus. Now, there are a couple of things at play with a child being the symbol of God's reign. One is that children are not as consumed with questions of honor and power as adults are. They tend to not be so jaded and cynical. Everything is new for children, and the world is a place of learning and exploration. We aren't born being inherently suspicious of people's motives. As children, until we learn otherwise, we're willing to see the best in people and to be generous in our interpretations of why people do the things they do. Children assume that people are naturally helpful, and people who welcome Jesus should strive to have these characteristics. We're not going to get it right all the time. I certainly don't, although I try. And it's through trying that we get better and better at this. But there's another idea that Jesus is probably demonstrating for the disciples, one that fortunately we are not as familiar with today. In the ancient world, childhood was very different than it is today. Something like 25 to 30% of all children would die before reaching adulthood. So although children were loved and cared for in their families and communities, the reality was that 1 out of 4, maybe even 1 out of 3 children would not survive childhood. So when Jesus says to the disciples that whoever welcomes a child for his sake welcomes him, he's comparing the greatness of God in the fragility of a child to his own greatness in laying down his life. Welcoming a child is to take on a potentially harrowing burden. Welcoming a child is committing to care for them, putting their needs before your own. Welcoming a child is knowing that you will grow to love them. Welcoming a child is to increase the probability of knowing grief, of being touched by death. On Ash Wednesday, we are reminded of our mortality and the mortality of those we love. We continue to celebrate this service because the church is one of the few places where we can acknowledge the reality of death in today's world. We don't like to talk about it, and we don't like to think about it, but we can't get to the resurrection without going through the death. In just a few moments, you'll be invited up to receive a palpable reminder of this, as the sign of the cross is made on your forehead in remembrance of baptism. We are all reminded that death doesn't have the final word. Yes, we are dust, and to dust we shall return. But Easter is coming, and our dust is washed away in the waters of our baptism. This Lenten season, I invite you to lean into the vulnerability, lean into the fragility of life and the harrowing burden of loving and caring for others. Seek out ways to care for those who need you. Practice generosity of spirit. Seek to welcome Jesus into your life in new and unexpected ways. Amen.